hier, ey? Gute Freunde, weil sie eines im Leben können, füreinander da zu sein. Lass doch die anderen reden, was kann uns schon geschehen? Wir werden heute und morgen nicht auseinandergehen. Gute Freunde kann niemand trennen, gute Freunde sind nie allein, weil sie eines im Leben können, füreinander sagen, wenn dir die Sonne scheint.
If you're doing a 4 days training, this is very useful, about half an hour.
Gute Freunde kann niemand
And the
trennen.
reason that I use it, apart from waking people up, is that it provides a very good illustration of the difference between a fire and an explosion. You'll have seen us being pouring the petrol onto the fire, onto the bonfire, and then he seemed to sort of a fuse arrangement. He poured it along the length of wood before he lit it. And in this case, two things emerge from this. First of all, you don't need a nuclear explosion to get a mushroom cloud, because what you're actually seeing there, that pillar of flame coming up, is the start of a mushroom cloud. Not very well defined, but that means that there is a rush of air going up in the centre there, carrying the unburnt petrol to a higher level when it starts to burn. So that's one of the things that comes out of that. But the other thing is, petrol vapour being 3.5 times the density of air, spreads out across the ground, which is why you've got the flat flame at ground level. And it's a fire, not an explosion, because the separation. The petrol vapour is below, the air is above, and it burns at the interface. But as soon as you move into the situation, I've got too many screens here, too many mice. As soon as you move into the situation where the flames reach the bonfire, where there is the pre-mix of the air and the petrol together because of the bonfire construction, you've got the explosion. Okay. Anyway, enough of that. What we actually came for today. As Colin said, I'm Ron Sinclair. I'm the technical manager at SGS Basifa. I've actually been doing this for, come November it will be 45 years. So I can remember a life before then, but not much. And I'm in a fortunate position where I say that as I get older, what I can remember is a much reduced part of what I've ever known in the first place. But I'm fortunate that working with me in Buxton, I've got an awful lot of people who can actually remind me of what it was that I actually knew once. So it all works very well. But I'm actually just going to go through 3 things here. What you're seeing is actually an updated version of a presentation I made to the Institute of Measurement and Control, Runcorn branch or whatever it is, Merseyside, in exactly a year ago, the night before the HazardX exhibition. I'm here because the HazardX exhibition was Wednesday and Thursday this week, so it's not too far to come up from Harrogate to here, and I'm back down to Buxton in the morning. And if you haven't picked up on the news, we're now one of the towns that's got a coronavirus patient in Buxton, which we'll find out how it's actually going to affect us, but one of the doctor's surgeries and one of the schools is closed. So where are we now in relation to ATEX and things related to ATEX? The 3 things I'm going to look at are the fact that we had a new directive, 2014-34 EU took over from 94-9 EC, and what were the implications of that? How's the changeover gone? You may all be totally content with that, in which case we'll dispose of that in 3 or 4 minutes. ADCO, Administrative Cooperation for surveillance, market surveillance issues, just bring up 1 or 2 things that the surveillance bodies in Europe have brought up in relation to ATEX that you might find of interest. And then the meat will be, how do we plan for the disaster that is Brexit and look forward, or whatever we have to do. So the first thing is, why did we get a new ATEX directive? Lots of the directives changed. The ATEX directive changed. It was totally rewritten, but used almost exactly the same words as before, and there was not any intended change of the thrust of what the directive was about. But it was all to do with what was called the new legislative framework. The European Commission had realised that they got a lot of directives, toy directive, medical equipment directive, pressure equipment directive, ATEX directive and so on, all the ones that they called the new approach directives, which said almost the same thing, but in slightly different language. And people started looking for the legal explanation for the difference in the language when there wasn't any intended. And so they decided that they would actually rationalise it. All those directives would be rewritten with a common way of expressing the same thing. And I think we would all agree that's not a bad objective. So that was the desire to have the same words mean the same in each directive. It also clarified the role of the economic operators. That's manufacturer, importer, local agent, etc., etc. They've all got very specific roles. In the older directive, they were all amalgamated into one set of requirements. They're now separated out. That's not really a change, but it helps people to understand. But there was no change to the technical requirements. So the fact that we got a new directive did not mean that there was any need to change technically any of the products that were certified to it. No change to the conformity assessment procedures. And certificates to the old directive, very specifically written into the new directive, the old certificates were to be valid for the new directive. The one thing that affected us as a notified body for ATEX was it strengthened the requirements for notification. And in fact, there were 3 or 4 European notified bodies who decided not to bother with having to comply with the more stringent requirements. I mean, we'd always said that this notification business, you know, you're not sure what you're going to get. Well, now you're probably still not sure exactly what you're going to get, but it's all a much closer approximation. The new directive compulsory applied from April 2016, and apart from a few questions around the transition, it was extremely smooth for notified bodies. Most manufacturers seem to have had no problems, but where we have had queries is from users of equipment, purchasers of equipment. We got the odd query. We've got this product has been installed for 3 years to the old directive. Do we have to get it recertified to the new directive? No, because you can't have it recertified because you're not making it. It's in existence. So there's a lot of queries of that nature that we had to deal with. In order to try and make it as clear as possible, when we issued a new supplement or a new addition to one of the older certificates, we put the informative text as follows into the wording of our certificates. Tell you what, I can hardly read it here. I'm going to come out of presentation view. How do I do that? I should never have started in. I hate the new PowerPoint for the new version. I love 2010 and 2014 versions. So it's showing it as duplicate, so why is it giving me an extended desktop? It's insisting on giving me an extended desktop here, so I've only got a miniature version of what you're looking at. And since I've got a small screen, that's very miniature when I try to read it. So it says, in accordance with Article 41 of the directive, EC-type examinations referring to the older directive that were in existence prior to the date of application, that's the 20th April 2016, may be referenced as if they were issued in accordance with the directive 2014-34. Supplementary certificates to such EC-type examination certificates and the new issues of such certificates may continue to bear the original certificate number issued prior to 20th of April. So that's what our reissued certificates say, and hopefully the World and his wife will actually read that. That's what it looks like in the certificate itself. The EU Commission had envisaged that the marketplace would sort out what people were actually prepared to accept. And they actually thought that the marketplace would demand that people would want new certificates, and that this carry-on of the old certificates would only be a temporary basis. But in fact, we've not seen any sign of that whatsoever. So the European Commission actually guessed wrong as to what the marketplace would do. And as far as we're concerned, actually just reissuing a certificate just to change a directive number is a complete waste of time. It's not adding anything to safety, so why on earth would you want to do it? So we're very happy with the current situation. Okay, that's just a little bit about that transition phase that we had. Now, the ADCO, the Administrative Cooperation for Market Surveillance, there's an ADCO for each different directive, and that reports to the Commission's ATEX working group, where I sit as chair of the CENELAC TC31 committee. And over the past 2 or 3 years, it has started to show that it's actually got some teeth. In this country, we're relying on HSE to do market surveillance, and they put about a quarter of a man-year resource into it every year. So quite clearly, they'd not seen it as a priority. They've got other things they want to do, like find out why various things blew up and so on. So market surveillance is not something that the HSE gives priority to, but Germany actually has a very active market surveillance activity in this field, and we're relying on Germany to actually pick up things that might be wrong with things in the UK. ADCO has a rotating chair. You're in post for every 2 years, and on the 1st of January 2019, UK had been chair for 2 years, and the chair passed to Poland. What you're seeing there is the pristine version and the remains of a solvent recycler. This is something that was brought up not because there was anything wrong with the certification of the recycler, but should there have been something else done to prevent people misusing it and ending up seriously injured. This was a portable unit. It had its own zoning in relation to the boiling of the solvent, creating a flammable atmosphere. But it was supposed to be very localised, and it had a long lead, and that was just supposed to plug into a normal wall socket. But the operator on this occasion did something stupid. He actually opened the lid while it was boiling. Quite patently, that is obviously not something you're supposed to do. He then ran over and pulled the plug out, carrying some of the vapour with him, and there was a flash at the plug, and there was a fire, not an explosion, and he was quite seriously injured. From that, there was consideration as to how far under ATEX those who are doing the manufacturing and those who are doing certification are supposed to take into account foolishness. In other words, you're supposed to take into account things that might happen but are not expected to happen. But this was so far out of the things that had been contemplated with this particular thing. It's led to a number of knock-on effects that I'm not sure are very good, but it gives you an idea of the sorts of things that get looked at. Everybody these days wants to carry a mobile phone or mobile tablet into a hazardous area so that they can actually record things, they can take photos of things and so on. And there are a number of manufacturers who do EX versions of tablets. Most of them are only category 3 to go into zone 2, but there are 1 or 2 to go into zone 1 that are flame-proof. And this was one that was actually picked up in Germany. And it was discovered by the German authority when they went into it that no short-circuit tests are being carried out on the lithium battery, as is actually required by the standard. And both the manufacturer and the notified body who'd issued the certificate said, oh, we didn't think that was necessary because it had got a UL listing as a battery for industrial purposes. Wrong. And the ADCO, once it was discussed later, actually confirmed the opinion that the missing and omitting the test that was there in the harmonised standard meant that you were not confirming that it actually met the essential health and safety requirements of the directive, and therefore it was not correctly certified. Now, this has been rumbling on for over 2 years, and at the moment we're waiting for court action in Germany, which the German government has taken against the manufacturer and the notified body concerned. But it's now held up waiting in queues for the court, all sorts of things. The problem is, as soon as you get conflict between different views and it becomes a legal matter, it takes an awful long time to resolve. In this case, which was when they picked up that a flame-proof motor wasn't, because when it was taken from the field and retested, it had actually failed the transmission tests. It would have transmitted the flame if there had been an internal ignition. And the casting had blowholes and the cemented joints didn't meet the standard and so on. There was very quick discussion and the manufacturer withdrew it voluntarily. That's what's supposed to happen. You're not supposed to end up in 2 years of protracted legal arguments. You know, people are supposed to accept that perhaps somebody does know better than we do, and we accept the view. There was another incident. This was an isolation flap valve that they looked at, and this is covered by 2 standards, and some of the tests that were required by those standards have just been missed. Now, you're entitled to miss out a test if you can show other evidence that gives equivalent confidence in what you're doing. So you don't have to do every test in the standard, but if you omit it, you've got to give a technical justification, which usually means that you've got information from some other source. So there are all sorts of things missing from this. Again, re-examination found that the product non-compliant with the standards, and the certificates were actually withdrawn, again with the cooperation of the manufacturer and the notified body. I would submit that the notified body shouldn't be actually issuing certificates for non-compliant product in the first place, but that's a separate issue. When it comes to ATEX, we often get asked to certify things that are outside the scope. There is a very comprehensive set of examples given in what we call the borderline list, which is an annex to the ATEX guidelines. And that tells you whether something is going to be considered in scope or not in scope. Because legally, if you certify something meeting the ATEX requirements and it's actually outside the scope of the directive, you're falling foul of the law itself. The way that we overcome it for our customers, because our customers' customers can sometimes be adamant and say, well, they've got one of them that's been certified, we want the one from you that's been certified. Well, you can't have it. So what we actually do is we issue an out-of-scope certificate confirming that the equipment is out of scope, not that it meets the requirements of the directive. The ATEX guidelines are a very useful document. Has anybody found them at all? On the European Commission's website. That's the URL there, and I gather you're probably going to get a copy of the slides at some stage. so you can pick it up, but it is very easy to find. Just European Commission, ATEX, and you'll find your way to that. And the guidelines, it's a fairly lengthy document, somewhere over 100 pages, but it does include the borderline list as well. And it gives you a lot of information about how to actually consider and interpret the information that's in the directive. So I wouldn't advise anybody to actually download the directive on its own these days, but to go straight for the guidelines. So, any questions on those aspects that I've raised before we move on to something which is probably of more pressing import to the people in this room?
And that solvent one is a very worrying one, because surely it's a much more complex piece of equipment than simply a piece of explosion-proof equipment that ought to have had more safeguards to stop
the lid being opened. It sounds as though there was a total...
It did. It did, and the operator defeated the interlock. Yeah, you can make things child-proof, but you can't make them determined adult-proof. Nobody knows why he did it. But it's just one of these strange things. No, it's odd. It's odd, but people do strange things from time to time. People cross roads directly in front of cars. There is a limit to how much cotton wool you can put around people without actually getting everybody muddled up and stuck in the cotton wool. You've got to allow people to take some responsibility for their own actions. And it was absolutely clear in the instructions for the solvent recycler and where the interlock was, and you mustn't open the lid under these circumstances, etc., etc. So if you want to go into details, there was possible evidence that the user of the solvent recycler hadn't been changing the gasket as often as he should have done on the lid. You can go into other contributory factors, because usually if there's an accident, there's more than one factor involved, and that was one of the contributory
factors. How well is ADCO understood? I've been out of it now for about 9 years, but I never remember any reference to ADCO.
Which is why I raised it. Because not many people know about ADCO. It's a very useful body, and it's picking up these market surveillance issues and doing good work, but it's not a body that is well known. I know about it because it's one of the bodies that reports to the European Commission meeting that I'm attending. But it's not something that most people would actually come across by accident. But it's useful to know that there is a body of that nature that's following things through and doing things of that type.
Before you move on to Brexit, can I ask a silly question? I thought EU directives were always applied in a country by legislation within that country.
They are.
So why are you talking about the EU directive? Why aren't you talking about whatever the relevant British legislation is that implements that directive?
Yes, the law is the UK statutory instrumentation, but because the way the directive is formulated, it has to be implemented without change in every member state. And because you're wanting to refer to what happens in every country, it's easier just to refer to the directive as if it is law.
Legislation just says this directive applies in the UK.
No, it actually copies it out. Yeah, it changes some of the words. It adds things to it. For instance, it adds the criminal penalty for failure to comply, because criminal penalties are a matter for what is known as subsidiarity. Where the European Union is not allowed to tell a country what the criminal penalties should be. I mean, the way that things have gone on, you thought there were no limits to what the EU can do, but there are lots of limits. It can't tell you what the criminal penalties are in your country. So the criminal penalties in Germany, France, Spain, Malta, Ireland, UK could very well all be different for failure to comply with the ATEX directive. because that's a matter for subsidiarity. That's another one of those wonderful European English words, subsidiarity. Yeah. And because of my involvement, I tend to trot them out and assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. But I realise that you get steeped in certain types of language. European ease, if you like.
Just a bit more about the tablet PC. If, when ADCO challenged the manufacturer on the battery not being short circuit tested, if they'd then gone away and tested the battery and had passed the test, would that have then...
That would have resolved the matter. Yeah.
Would have resolved it, but presumably it wouldn't have passed the...
Well, the thought is that it probably wouldn't have passed, because that would have solved the matter totally. But I don't know absolutely the answer to that. I can see eyes.
I've heard worrying remarks from some people in the industry saying that they've looked at a lot of certificates on ATEX certified equipment which haven't stood up to analysis. Somebody once quoted me, said he looked at a lot of nameplates and he'd never yet found you in terms of ones that are issued by notified bodies have been found to be faulty, given that there's an awful lot.
I'm surprised he's never found one.
Self-certified by manufacturers. Are we saying that if there's a
that is a problem moving.
found to be faulty, given that there's an awful lot of equipment out there that's self-certified by manufacturers? Are we saying that
That is a problem moving between the two systems. That's one of the reasons why ATEX is no longer accepted in Australia, for example, because they thought Europe was daft in going for the split types of conformity assessment. But for a while, before we had IECX available, ATEX was the only kid on the block outside Australia that was anywhere thought to be anywhere near good enough. So ATEX was being accepted in Australia for a time. But now they no longer accept that. It has to be IECX if it's coming from outside. Or ANZ, the certification, of course, the national certification for Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, you can have that. There is a different tradition in different places as to how the certificates are written. The tradition that we've always had at BASIFA, and if you know the history, we've been in existence under that name since 1967. And the history goes beyond that at the Buxton site to the 1920s when they first started doing research in Buxton. So I come from a background that's steeped deeply in the history and what can go wrong, whereas some of the other bodies sort of come along, they were doing other things. They say, oh, there's another directive, we'll do that one as well, which means that they haven't got the background that perhaps that we have, and that is something that has caused issues. Our tradition has always been to have a lot of text in the certificate that explains things. If you go to the other side of the Atlantic, if you have a UL listing, for example, it will just be a whole long list of model numbers. It doesn't tell you. You've got no means of knowing what those model numbers represent. And that philosophy has come through into some of the certificates you see from USA. And don't forget that UL, through their UL DEMCO notified body, can actually issue ATEX certificates in the States. You'll find that UL DEMCO branded certificates signed by Paul Kelly of UL in Northbrook, just outside Chicago. So it's a muddled system, and if you like, what you're saying is just a representative part of that problem.
Does that stem from America originally not accepting the concept of intrinsic safety, and then realising that they've actually got to accept it, and therefore they've gone for what might appear as an easy option by linking up with DEMCO?
No. Basically, DEMCO is a comparatively small organisation, and much of the testing that results in a DEMCO certification is done either in the States or in China.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Not done actually by DEMCO.
It's not done actually by
They're
DEMCO.
badged at being-
It's badged by them. But legally, DEMCO in Denmark are actually accepting the responsibility for the certificates that have come from the other labs. But you do get disparity, unfortunately.
Another flag of convenience.
I'm not going to comment on that. You may think that, but I cannot possibly comment. Okay, Brexit. Did we get Brexit done on the 31st of January or whatever it was, 31st of December or the 31st of March, whatever? I would submit not. We took one step forward in saying we've now got to get Brexit done because otherwise we can't go back. But we still haven't got a clue what Brexit is actually going to mean. Not to most of industry. And we're reliant on what's going to happen in the trade deals, and there's a lot of posturing going on. I was at the European Notified Bodies Group for ATEX meeting at the start of February. So that's less than 4 weeks ago now. And at that meeting, we had problems because that was just after we had notionally left. At the previous meeting the year prior to that, the whole of the group had said that whatever happens to the UK, we still want the UK notified bodies in whatever form they are. If they can't be full members, then we want them as observers of this group because we welcome their technical input, etc., etc. So all the UK bodies were invited to that meeting, and then a week before the meeting, just 2 days before that Brexit date, we got emails saying that we were no longer welcome. Now, we all went, and I was wearing my SGS FIMCO hat, not my SGS Pacifa hat, because, I'm representing Finland. Yeah, okay. Just the same as Denmark is representing the US, if you like. So this weaseling around could be made to work in more than one direction. And we then saw the email that had come from higher up in the European Commission, which said that if any UK notified bodies were allowed to be present, the European Commission would withdraw the funding for the meeting, and it would be the chairman who became personally liable to pay for the meeting. And that all happened in less than a week before that 31st of January deadline. Now, I'm going to be charitable and say that's just part of the European Commission's posturing. I mean, clearly there's posturing going on in Westminster as well. And hopefully, at some stage, all the posturing will arrive at some common vision of where we might go forward. I mean, the 31st of December, we've told, is now critical. That date can't be changed. I bet it can if we really have to.
Brits account for 70% of the technical standards brought out the EU.
Sorry?
Brits account for 70% of the technical standards out there brought out the EU. So we're not exactly our expertise. These technical bodies, it comes from HUSBOT. So
oh yeah, and I mean, I'm chair of CENELEC TC31, the electrical standards in Europe, and I will remain chair of CENELEC TC31. Well, not indefinitely, because I'm thinking that I might actually retire eventually. So I'm going to divest myself of some of these hats that I keep wearing, and that will be one of them in the not too distant future. But our membership of CENELEC is totally independent from our membership of the EU, and it is agreed that BSI publishes the CENELEC standards and the CEN standards without change. That's part of the agreement. So whether we remain in or outside the EU, the technical requirements and those standards will apply anyway. okay, there are some areas in which we don't have SEN and SENELEC standards, and the scope for other things. But BSI is legally obliged to publish the SEN and SENELEC standards as British standards, and they've got 6 months to do it after the European standard is published. That is their legal agreement with SEN and SENELEC that they will do that. So that will continue. So the whole idea of we'll have different standards for this, that, and the next thing it just seems a very odd thing. So we don't know whether or not we will be in or out, or halfway in or halfway out, or however you want to talk about it, from the 31st of December onwards. If we've got a trade agreement that includes notionally common technical requirements, which, as I say, most of them, at least in our field, we would have all of them from the SENELEC standards anyway. So it might be on a case-by-case basis. We don't know. We might have a trade agreement that means selectively we've got no customs tariffs, or we might not. And it still remains possible that on the 31st of December we fall off the cliff edge, just as everybody was worried about falling off the cliff edge 3 weeks ago. Again, who knows? Who can tell based on the political posturing that's going on? So we as a notified body have to consider how we deal with it. We may have been told you're not welcome at that meeting, but under the transition agreement, our certificates are still welcome in the rest of Europe. It's a peculiar situation that we're in. If we're sticking with the common technical requirements, I'll put it on the screen now, there's been no suggestion from anybody that the UK should resign from SEN or SENELEC. That's never been put on the table, and BSI have been at pains to actually make that clear in press releases and so on. And BSI are committed to publishing those standards without deviation. However, SEN and SENELEC work does come partly in mandates from the European Commission. And if, in writing the standard, they fail to comply with the terms of that mandate, they won't get their money from the Commission. Now, the people who actually draft the standards don't get their money anyway. It merely supports the head office thing. So I think that as really in our area for ATEX, we're going to automatically follow the technical requirements for the EU anyway, whatever the eventual outcome. So I don't think we will have different technical requirements.
Presumably government has got no justification for interfering in that. It's
absolutely none.
In no one's interest.
Yeah, I mean, the government doesn't know technically what controls the gaps on a piece of flame-proof equipment. We're dealing with discussions that take place at a detailed technical level. The government should just keep its nose out of it, is the way I would put it. But that's my view on that.
The same applies to other technical standards.
Sorry?
Presumably, you're talking particularly here around ATEX, but the same will apply to other technical standards.
Same will apply
the
to most of the standards.
Will follow the EN standard and
Yes.
will continue to do so because we've got the same sort of agreement.
Yeah.
Except we've got no say in it.
So why doesn't it just sort of just keep rolling forward? Is that how you
Well, don't ask me.
But as long as we keep our membership on SENELEC and SEN committees,
Yes.
and our influence in writing the darn things.
Yeah. I mean, that's the important thing. We've got to keep and stay active and make sure that we get our influence in how they're written. But for ATEX, most of the standards are written.
Have your own committee doing a British thing and then a European thing, they start to diverge.
That's the last thing that anybody wants.
Effort, isn't it? Yeah.
Industry does not want to have to make two different products for sale in France and the UK.
Well, that's exactly the reason why the Americans have gone with the DEMCO activity, isn't it? They wanted to move away from their own in-house standards to standards that were
Acceptable everywhere.
Acceptable everywhere.
Yes.
And we want to continue that Brussels or no?
Absolutely. And ideally, we want to continue the other half of the standardisation process, which is the validation. Because standardisation is not just about writing standards, it's actually about showing that things comply with those standards, which is where the certification part of the process comes in, the notified body activity. And it's reasonable that if we're all working to common standards, then we should continue as bodies offering the certification on the same basis with mutual acceptability. It's just a logical way of moving forward. But as we all know, politicians aren't always totally logical. So we just don't know. I mean, there are two countries currently outside the European Economic Area. Remember that most of the directives apply not just to the EU, but to the whole of the European Economic Area, which is the EU plus Norway, which is the big one, Iceland and Liechtenstein. Switzerland is not in the European Economic Area. It remained outside when the rest of EFTA joined. Something to do with banking rules and regulations, I believe. But Switzerland has 2 notified bodies for ATEX, and Turkey has 2 notified bodies for ATEX because they signed up for mutual recognition agreements. So in my mind, my simple approach to these things, I can see absolutely no reason why the UK can't have similar agreements and we continue exactly as we are. And that's what I would hope for. But as we always all know, hoping for and achieving are not the same. So that's the way I would like to see it. Interestingly, also, under CETA, the Canadian and European Trade Agreement, CETA, Canada also can theoretically appoint notified bodies. They haven't done so yet, but that's within the provisions of CETA that they should be able to do so. And, you know, people have talked about a Canadian-style agreement, and then the Barnier or whoever it was said, oh, you can't have that, you're physically too close to us to have that type of agreement, and etc. So, I mean, it's all still posturing. Until the posturing is finished and we get some sort of agreement, we won't know where we are. But if they did have an exact Canada-style agreement, we could still be notified bodies anyway. I'll put the term notified bodies in inverted commas because the bodies from Switzerland and Turkey are not officially notified bodies. They've got another term, which I can't remember at the moment, but they act as if they are notified bodies, and the certificates are accepted as if they are notified bodies. So, as I see it, that's the way forward that I would actually like to go down. Probably the outcome of that will be that the existing UK notified bodies continue as now, with their documents fully acceptable in the European Economic Area, and the UK would continue to accept CE marking as the basis for technical acceptability in the UK from notified bodies elsewhere in the EU. Which is
the outward and visible sign, which might ruffle a lot of feathers all the time.
Yeah. I mean, they may decide to do that on a directive by directive basis. I don't know. Probably ATEX is more straightforward than some of the other directives, is my guess. I'm not intimately involved with the other directives, but I do know some of them have little quirks. If, on the other hand, we end up either with no agreement on trade or we fall off the cliff edge again on the 31st of December, the UK has already got the fallback position in place. And this was in place before the March 31st date last year. So I've tucked away on my machine somewhere, I've got a copy of the replacement for ATEX. It's not called a directive, it's called a statutory instrument. And believe it or not, as a statutory instrument, all it is a variation on the current statutory instrument that invokes ATEX. So again, there is no written proposal from the government that we have seen, but remember this is about a year old now, that would actually cause us to think that the government is wanting to ditch the actual ATEX requirements, because they've actually prepared a new version of a UK only thing. And the thing that changes, is that on the next slide? I mean, this picks up on the point that you made earlier. The ATEX directive is not itself the law, but it's brought into law in every country by its appropriate national legislation. So the existing UK legislation is 2016 number 1107, and that's called the Equipment and Protective. Yeah, I mean, it's a concoction by lawyers, not by technical people. No, which is why the technical requirements are actually still the same. That's not been changed. No. Well, as long as they don't touch those, well, it's business as usual, near enough. So from late 2018, we saw the words of that, but after the various deadlines, we've not heard another dicky bird about it, but we assume that that is likely to be what would be brought forward again if needed. I can't see them having another go at rewriting it, but who knows, who knows. One of the problems is that if you try and read them, they're not very easy to follow. It's actually written as a list of changes, and there are a number of individual words that change. So it talks about in paragraph 3, subsection 1, change, remove this word and add that word, which means to actually read it is a nightmare. So I had a go at it when it first came out. But basically, it deletes all reference to ATEX and insert the UK only references, and no changes to the technical requirements. It talks about harmonised standards becoming accepted standards. Okay, different term, means exactly the same thing. An accepted standard will support compliance with the HSRs of the UK statutory regulation, whatever it is. On the day of, well, it's supposed to be on the day of exit, but it's not happened, so no doubt it will be on the day of the 31st of December or whenever that is. All UK notified bodies automatically become UK approved bodies. So that again is new terminology, but it effectively means the same thing in the UK as it did previously. So that was supposed to happen on the 30th of March last year. It didn't, so we're actually just assuming that that will be carried forward as an intention. But, they can't actually do that. They can't call us approved bodies until the legislation, that is this amendment to the statutory instrument, is in place, because that's what actually gives effect to what a UK approved body is. And the same will apply to all the other directives as well. So really, we've still got a bit of a wait and see on that one. Again, assuming that we've got the disaster situation, from the 31st of December, UK approved bodies will only be able to issue UK type examination certificates, not EU type examination certificates, and they will only be acceptable in the UK. Now, if this happens on the day, effectively on the 31st of December, we will not have reissued every existing certificate by the 1st of January. There are limitations to what physically notified bodies, or whatever we call ourselves, can actually get done in a given time. So there's going to be an overlap. But the overlap that we've seen actually puts the UK at a disadvantage. And this is self-imposed, because it has been said that for a period after, it was a period after leaving, but it's now a period after the transition, CE marking on a product will be acceptable. But the UK bodies can't approve CE marking or can't allow CE marking onto a UK-made product. Therefore, the only way to get this done and sorted in advance is for UK manufacturers to have a CE marking European acceptable certificate in place before that date. Now, that to my mind is really shooting yourself in the foot. But that's I have to say it's a personal understanding, but having read the bits of paper, that's what I think they've said. And we did actually, at a meeting, we did actually ask BEIS, was that the intention? They said, oh yes, it's the simplest thing to do. You know, not a problem to them, but just a problem to the whole of UK industry.
It's a bit like getting the blue passport made in Poland.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, you can still use CE mark.
How many people in this room care what colour their passport is? You know, we're fiddling around the edges, getting unimportant things sorted.
Distraction politics.
It's distraction, as you say.
But what would then happen to new products that come onto the market after that date?
Well, my conclusion, based on what I've seen, it could still change, would be that they would need to have CE marking from an EU 27 notified body outside the UK, or a UK CA certificate from a UK approved body. But the UK approved bodies, if they're only appointed on the 31st of December, can't have all those certificates in place on the 1st of January. So it's an impossible task. But it has effectively been clearly stated as policy, or it was last time it was talked about. I mean, it can have changed. No, you know, the government doesn't tell me everything that it's thinking about. I'm not that privileged. They could have changed their minds on this, but the last time we had a pronouncement that if its CE marking is based on a UK notified body certificate, that will not be acceptable after 31st of December. Well, we knew it wouldn't be acceptable in the rest of the EU, but they're also saying it won't be acceptable in the UK. And that is what I say is the shooting in the foot.
It seems completely, I'm sorry, it seems completely contrary to the statement above. It says there's going to be a time transition period.
Yes, but that's only a transition period to accept CE marking from bodies outside the UK. You mean the central bullet point there? Central bullet point there, yeah.
Central bullet point. So in other words, we can accept, we'll be able to accept stuff from Europe after the 31st during the transition period, but we won't be able to accept anything with CE marking produced in this country.
That is my interpretation of what the documentations I have seen says.
Presumably you'd still be able to accept UK certificates that were issued before.
All certificates issued before that date, yes, they're perfectly fine.
It just sounds like a negotiating thing.
Yeah, I mean it's. We're not in the real world, to be perfectly honest here. Well,
there's a distinct lack of sense in common sense by the sound of it.
I'm not going to comment again on that.
You could apply that to the whole thing, couldn't you?
Yeah. So what we're saying, this sums it up. From the 31st of December, for sale in the UK, the product must, from the 31st of December, must have been placed on the market either with a CE certificate from an EU notified body, that's not from the UK, or with a UK certificate from a UK approved body. But the UK approved bodies aren't going to be able to reissue all those new certificates on the 1st of January, because we won't be appointed, as far as I'm aware, until the 31st of December. So it's really chickens and eggs here. So how do we get over it? Well, I've already hinted at this when I said that in Brussels, I'm from Finland. Sorry, I can't speak any Finnish, but I'm from Finland. In Finland, they all speak English perfectly. So,
Sorry, all of our water bodies have already done that. BSI has relocated, was it Denmark, parts of it? British Standards, just so it has its awarding powers.
yeah, all the bodies have taken the steps to either create their own satellite in the EU, or like us, we're partnering with another part of the wider organisation to do exactly the same thing.
So organisations are covered. So universities have done the same. They've put satellite ones across.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, the problem is that all costs money.
Yeah.
You know, we're paying FIMCO a few £1,000s a month for the privilege of putting their name on the certificates instead of ours. And that all has to be paid for by industry somewhere along the line. There's not a magic money tree to pay for that. So however, industry is actually paying for all of this one way or the other. May not be identifiable on the balance sheet as such, but nonetheless, that's where the actual costs of all this end up. So the next slide is specific to SGS Pacifica, but as you've said, other bodies are doing similar, if not identical, things. So we've partnered with SGS FIMCO. They're based in Helsinki, and they are now qualified as a notified body for ATEX. Not too difficult to achieve because they were already notified for the Machinery Directive, Measurement Products Directive, and a couple of others that are relevant where the work is also done in the UK. So it's not a question of starting something from scratch. They're part of SGS, and I don't know how much you know about the history of SGS, but it's far and away the largest test certification and inspection body in the world. We've got over 90,000 employees across the world. The second largest is Intertek, and that's about the third the size of SGS. Actually, Intertek came across a problem because they decided to partner with Intertek Italia, and then all of a sudden the Italian government said, yes, of course you can do that, but the certificates will be published in Italian. Hiccup. I'm not sure how it's been resolved in the end. As far as we're concerned, in Finland, both Finas, that's the Finnish accreditation service equivalent to UCAS in the UK, and the Finnish government are quite happy that all the documentation for the types of certificates that we're interested in are only published in English. And the agreement with FIMCO is that they have appointed 3 of us in Buxton as direct contractors to FIMCO, and we are therefore contracted to act on behalf of FIMCO, and it actually says on a FIMCO certificate, if I'm signing it, it says authorised signatory on behalf of SGS FIMCO. So in practice for the manufacturer, it's almost a transparent process, because if they've been used to getting an SGS Pacifica certificate from Buxton, they will now have an SGS FIMCO certificate from Buxton. Yes, there's a bit that goes on in the background because FIMCO are taking legal responsibility, so they've actually got to see what's going on, so draft copies go backwards and forwards and so on. But in order to make it as easy as possible for the customer, we're dispatching directly from Buxton. And all the technical work is done in Buxton. So those SGS FIMCO certificates will be immediately acceptable in the UK, ongoing into what will be that transition period after the current transition period, when the UK government says that CE marking will be accepted even after we've properly left the EU. So that's the way that we've got it covered. I mean, it's a bodge, but unfortunately, if you're given a right load of rubbish to work with, bodging it is basically all that you can do. Yeah, I think I've actually said that, haven't I? There's a common IT system between us and FIMCO that enables the passage of the documents backwards and forwards reasonably seamlessly. So we're not actually having to send bits of paper to Finland. So it's all covered reasonably well. So that's the type examination certificates. That is as transparent as possible for the manufacturers. However, when it comes to the QAN, the Quality Assessment Notification, which is the production part of ATEX for most products, it's not quite so simple, because the requirement is that the number of the notified body responsible for quality appears on the label of the product. So manufacturers, when they swap their QAN to FIMCO, have to change from 1180, which is our number, to 0598, which is the FIMCO number. So that change does require action on the part of the manufacturer to change the label. So that is something that has to be done. And quite clearly, that is a cost involved. It's not a cost to us specifically, but that is another cost that the manufacturer has to pick up. But none of the UK notified body numbers will remain under this scenario. Unless, of course, we get a decent Brexit and we all carry on as normal, in which case, what on earth have we been worrying about? What I say is we plan for the worst and hope for the best. You know. So the holders of the existing EU type examination certificates, currently from us, they're being offered a free formal transfer of the certificates. Yes, we've got a bit of work to do. Yes, FIMCO charges for it, but it's not the customers that have caused this problem. You know, and for the amounts involved, it's not worthwhile actually trying to upset customers to get them to pay for something they don't really want in the first place. So we took the decision we would do it absolutely free and absorb the cost of the whole process. And doing it free actually removes a number of the costs that would have been there anyway. Certificate number doesn't change. The BASIFA prefix doesn't change, and that will remain. What I've said here is that there isn't a formal obligation to show the notified body responsible for type examination, but since BASIFA remains as the prefix to the number, it would help to resolve queries if the declaration actually overtly named FIMCO as the notified body applicable to that certificate. You know, this is what I'm saying. It's easier to give the answer to a question before it's been asked, and that's my suggestion. That's not a legal requirement. I'm just suggesting it might be a sensible thing to do. When it comes to internal control of production, all these Category 3 ATEX items, all the Category 2 non-electrical, none of these things that we've seen really change this. It doesn't actually say what form the documentation needs to be in any difference from what we've got at the moment. So we think that the best way for manufacturers moving forward for the immediate second transition phase is just to carry on doing what they've been doing and use the CE marking until we find out a bit more about what actually is going to happen. Probably at some stage there will be a requirement for an EU declaration and a requirement for a UK declaration. What I would hope is that somehow or other they can both be on the same piece of paper. You know, to try and make things as simple as possible. Oh, is that product going to the UK or is it going to France? Oh, I better put that declaration in with it. Oh no, it better be that. It's far simpler if you've only got one piece of paper. So what I've been talking about now is if there is no agreement that allows us to carry on as effective notified bodies. So is it all going to be necessary? Well, I don't know. You can look at your crystal ball as well as I can look at my crystal ball and come up with an appropriate answer.
Is the terms of vested interests, the vested interests in fishing and in various other places, but in industry in general, as regards your topic, I'm not aware of any good that can come out of changing any of this.
Neither am I.
So what's driving it?
You would have to ask Boris Johnson.
Ideology.
Yeah, ideology.
Politics is
No, it's we all have to obey our political masters, otherwise there's anarchy on the streets. Well, I can't see us all gathering together with banners saying what marching down Whitehall saying keep ATEX, ATEX or whatever.
Well, that's a problem. Most people wouldn't understand it.
Yeah, but effectively that's the alternative to accepting what we're landed with, I suppose. I don't know.
Are there any lessons we can learn from Australia and New Zealand, I wonder? Because effectively they're outside the grouping at the moment. You know, are there ways that they currently work? If, say we were doing a job out there.
Yeah. Well, if you're selling to Australia or New Zealand in this field, then the documentation you want is ICX. And that's directly acceptable everywhere in Australia and New Zealand, except if you're going into a mining application in Queensland. And the relevant inspector of mines in Queensland is going to retire later this year, so we're assuming it will come into line with the rest of Australia.
So where else is ICEX accepted?
It's accepted in a lot of places around the world. Where it's got legal acceptance as the same status as national certification, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, India and Israel.
What I'm just wondering is there not a case that we should be moving to actually be part of that ICEX group rather than anything else?
That is certainly a possibility. I suspect that the UK government might take the same view as the EU Commission did to that suggestion, and that is the legal framework and being able to sanction the certification bodies. This was the only reason that the EU didn't actually move in that direction. It was discussed, and they said, no, we can't do that because we require to have legal control over the notified bodies. If it's an ICX certificate, we will not have legal control over the body issuing the certificate. That is my understanding of the way that the discussions went.
Because the EU would be arguing that they had legal control over each of the individual states.
Yes,
Bodies.
but they wouldn't over an ICX certificate that was issued in Australia or the US or India or Singapore or any of the China or any of the other places. You know, could the EU actually prosecute a Chinese ICX body because they didn't think they'd done a certificate correctly?
That stuff comes out of China that isn't exactly conform, even though it's CE mark.
Yeah, perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned China. Yeah.
It's obvious when you go down there, they even tell you, is it fake or real? Well, it's fake. I think there's a piece of like best practice or law where they have to tell you if it's fake or real.
Yes. Yes, I do know. We've got to be very careful when we're dealing with China. Even with SGS in China, we've got to be careful. So it's all down to, even if there is a will to sort it out the way that I'm suggesting it ought to be sorted out, will there be time to do it? This is why I'm worried about they're not starting the negotiations until a full month after we left. So that's 3.5 weeks that's got lost already. You know, time is going to pass very, very quickly if everybody's pontificating and taking entrenched positions. Even if we end up with the right result on the let's say on the 25th of December and leaving.
You lose a month for some holidays.
Yeah, you know, it's going to be very tight.
Outside of EU practice, stop the clock.
beyond my pay grade. So we're in the formal transition position at the moment. We're in the transition phase, not the later one, but currently. So from 31st of December onwards, all UK notified bodies remain in place and are listed on the EU NANDO database. That's where notified bodies are listed. So SGS Pacifica and all the others are still listed on the NANDO database. Therefore, we are still entitled to issue notified body certificates, and that's absolutely clear. What we're not entitled to do, apparently, is to attend the notified bodies group in Brussels. All the existing documents from UK notified bodies remain fully valid. That's the EU type examination certificate and the quality assurance notification. And again, this is, I've actually said this, the European Commission decided to, I've been talking out of order. You know, I wrote these slides, actually, this version of them on Monday of this week, and I've forgotten what I actually wrote in them. I got it out of order. But this is basically is what I've said about the fact that we're not welcome at the Notified Bodies Group meeting. I mean, there's quite an argument between the chairman, who's from PTB in Germany, and the European Commission representative at the meeting, and he just said, I didn't ask for it, it was imposed. Yeah, I mean, it's odd, because I'm vice chair of the body. So, as I said, and it says there on the slide, I officially was representing SGS FIMCO. And basically it comes down to the statement that we've had from, I think, Michel Barnier and one or two others. Nothing is agreed until it all is agreed. We'll see when that actually is. So we've dealt with, I think, an awful lot on the way through, but we've actually used up slightly over the hour. But you know, I'm quite happy to talk further on any of those aspects that you wish to talk about. Or have I worried you enough that you'd rather go home and have a whiskey?
It's not as bad as I thought it would be.
Oh, good. Well, rest assured that, I mean, I can only talk in detail about what SGS Pacifica is doing, but as far as I'm aware, all the other UK notified bodies are taking similar steps.
Yes. So does this philosophy and methodology likely to apply in other areas?
I would imagine it will apply to all the directives of that type. So machinery directive, EMC directive, and so on. Pressure vessels. But I'm not directly involved in those, so I can't pronounce an opinion on those. But intuitively, it would seem that it's very similar. Yeah. I mean, it seems logical that they should all be treated in the same way. But that's an awful lot of legislation that would have to get passed through Parliament at very short notice.
I thought too. We bubble our way through on that basis.
But
Yeah.
in reality, if it's all done with statutory instruments, they don't get looked at by Parliament. They get laid on the table, and
Yeah.
a fortnight later, well, they're nodded through.
Yes, that's why they talk about it being laid before Parliament, isn't it? It's most unusual for the MPs to actually debate it.
I mean, is it possible that there can be just a blanket agreement that all technical directives will be nodded through?
It can.
You have to tidy up the references and stuff, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I guess it could be nodded through with provisos.
Yeah.
In the same way we've got approved bodies instead of notified bodies, what we need is an alternative version. They need to be not EU directives, they're British something or others, but they mean exactly the same.
Yeah. Yes.
Because otherwise Bill Cash and all his mates will get uptight. You see it being done in a handful of paragraphs.
Yes.
A very simple document.
Just one at a time, otherwise.
Well, as I say, the actual amending text for the statutory instrument implementing ATEX is as long as the existing statutory instrument.
So, what influence do you guys actually have on government in this respect?
I would say none. Not in this.
They can't make decisions without you, can they?
Yes, they can.
Previous things on consultation about both the original ATEX directive and the revised ATEX directive, we were involved in consultations by, well, it was DTI at that time. I mean, the original directive, I wasn't high enough up the organisation, but I remember a couple of my senior managers trotting off to London to have discussions about the UK input to the wording that was going to be used for ATEX. Now, I'm not aware that there has been any similar discussion about the drafting of the replacement UK legislation. I have to say not aware because there might have been, but it's certainly not involved the current notified bodies.
It's a much wider thing, obviously, that you've been talking about. It affects the automotive industry, for instance, and
Yeah.
other areas that have got technical standards to comply with. One can only assume that if there's a trade agreement in place, there's going to be some blanket legislation that enables things to go forward.
I wonder if
Changes to the standard changes to documentation in terms of badging or
I wonder if one of the differences between the original ATEX and now is the fact that the CEPA has been privatised and is no longer
No longer a government
no
department.
longer a government department. The reason you were involved before was because you were a direct link into government.
That was possible at the earlier stage, but there was consultation on the new directive, and since we've been private since 2002, we were given copies of things to comment on. None of us actually went to a meeting, but we were given things to comment on. And since it was basically just changing the words without changing the effect, there was no need to have a long, in-depth conversation at that stage. But yes, there was at least a notional consultation of those directly involved at that stage. So, have I talked myself into your submission? You will gather that I'm not shy of hearing my own voice, which can sometimes be a blessing and sometimes also be a curse. But hopefully, everybody's got something out of this that either confirmed your worst fears or confirmed it wasn't as bad as you thought it might be, or what on earth was he talking about? Oh, perhaps I better think about it. I don't know. As I say, a lot of this was just reworked from quite clearly a slightly different presentation I gave last year to the group in Runcorn. But what I find, I've got sufficient numbers of presentations on my laptop that I very rarely have to start from scratch these days. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you for coming along. Presenting with the 6 time.
You'll never guess what? I'm actually wearing an IEC tie tonight because I suddenly realised I'd turned up in Harrogate without a tie. And Chris Aegis, who's the administrative secretariat for ICX, was there giving a presentation, and I happened to be mentioning it to him. He says, "Oh, I've got a spare IEC tie. I'll give it." So I've now got an IEC tie, which means officially I come from Geneva. which of course may not be in the EU, but it's a nice place to come from. Okay, thank you very much for this. This is very kind of you. Yes, I'm afraid these days, like many people, I don't normally wear a tie. But in fact, I don't normally turn up to work wearing a jacket either, but I'm in my chairman of the meetings uniform.
Thanks very much. It's been very interesting, having been closely involved with it back in the 70s and 80s. I hadn't realised that there had been yet another directive.
All right.
The legislative one had completely passed me by since I retired.
That's the way of it. That's the way of it. Better put this back the way it was.
Well, all I can say is I'm glad I'm retired.
Well,
there is a life out there, isn't there, George, now?
Absolutely.
well, I could be retired. I'm 75 after all. So, but I actually choose to carry on working because I enjoy what I do and people are prepared to pay me to do it, which is always a good reason to continue.
Well, I stopped when IEC 615